Welcome to the official podcast of the 349th Air Mobility Wing Public Affairs here at Travis Air Force Base, California. You're listening to the first of a series of monthly podcasts scheduled for the year 2020. Our podcast episode for today is entitled One for the Ages, A Historian's Perspective. Please understand that the views expressed in this podcast are not necessarily the views of the U.S. Air Force nor the Air Force Reserve, and no endorsement of any particular person or business is ever intended. Hello, this is Master Sergeant Jose Aquilizan of the 349th Air Mobility Wing Public Affairs, and welcome to One for the Ages, A Historian's Perspective. Our special guest today is Dr. Michael Blodgett. He has taught at the university level prior to joining the Air Force team. In his academic career, he has taught such courses as United States history, the history of Europe after World War II, the history of terrorism, and the modern Middle East. He has mentored well over 1,000 university students. Prior to his career in academia, Dr. Blodgett served 5 years in the United States Army as an intelligence analyst and as a psychological operations specialist. During this time, he studied Soviet order of battle and culture within Eastern Europe. He was responsible for briefing divisional and corps commanders on the Soviet threat and methods of defeating that threat. He was further responsible for analyzing areas of popular discontent in Eastern Europe and developing methods of exacerbating that discontent. Team Travis, here is our guest, Dr. Michael Blodgett. Well, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Blodgett.
Thank you.
I'm really very curious how you got involved in the line of work that you do now.
Well, a lot of it has to do with my military background. I was working at the university. I'd worked in the university for 15 years, and it was getting old. I was getting tired of it. I was looking for a new challenge, and I wanted to go to an organization that supported its people. I wanted to go to an organization where I felt like I was making a difference in people's lives.
Indeed.
And so I started looking around the Air Force historical program, and when I saw this job, I grabbed at it because it was a chance to do what I wanted to do, as well as stay in California where my family is.
Now, it's interesting to note that prior to you taking over the position, I understand that position has been vacant for a little bit of time?
That position had been vacant for 5 years.
That's amazing.
It's amazing. It's also a problem because I'm dependent on my sources. I like to tell people I'm only as good as my sources. Indeed. And I need the contact with the squadrons. I need the contact with the groups in order to gather the information to be an effective historian.
So prior to your career, are there any other interests that you had that ultimately led you to your taking on a historical academic pursuit?
Well, strangely enough, first of all, I'm an old Cold Warrior. The Soviet Union was evil. It needed to be destroyed. I mean, that was me as a young man. And oddly enough, I wanted to be a CIA officer when I left the Army. That's what my early education was about. That got sidetracked by a marriage and to a woman who wouldn't leave Simi Valley. In the late 90s, I decided I was going to do something for me. So I went back to graduate school in history. And one of my mentors was a historian who was hired by the United Nations to go to the former Yugoslavia and research the massacres at Srebrenica. And when I saw that, I said, that's what I want to do. That's the kind of impact I want to have. I don't want to be the historian who is writing articles for other historians. I want to be the historian who has an impact on the larger world around me. And that really led me in the direction that I went, first to teaching and then to the Air Force.
It's really a tremendous responsibility hearing you talk about all the details of what you need to do. Having to capture all that data, I imagine there's some kind of groundwork or some kind of guidelines on how you the methodology and how you collect your historical data and how you would report it. So what would qualify, or maybe just give us a little bit of information about how you acquire this historical data?
Okay. I acquired the historical data basically through two means. One is the published material, Air Force articles, newspaper articles about the wing. But that's relatively unimportant. The way that I really gather my data is by face-to-face contact with the airmen in the unit. And that's one of the important things that I'm working on, that I'm going to have to work on over the next few weeks and months, is reestablishing the information links. Because with the position being empty for 5 years, the knowledge that units have to tell me when there's a promotion, when there's an event going on, when there's an award being presented, those links have kind of disappeared. And I have to reestablish those links. I have to get to the units, I have to get to the squadrons, I have to get to the groups and let them know that I'm here. And that I need that information. I need to tell that story, if you will. So yeah, I really think that the personal relationships are what need to be built up. Again, I can get things through newspaper articles. That'll solve a little bit of my problem, but the personal relationships are really what matter.
You know, that how you said personal relationships, that definitely strikes a chord, because that's the challenge when we're talking about a reservist. Because for reservists here at 349th Air Mobility Wing, a majority of the personnel are what you would call TRs, or traditional reservists. Yeah. What that means, essentially, when it comes to the time frame, you're here once a month. So establishing personal relationships is very difficult. And also trying to get those stories out and collect all those stories about what's been happening. Speaking of, this has been the year of stories, hasn't it?
It certainly has. I mean, first of all, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, exactly. And then we deployed personnel to New York City.
That's right.
To deal with that pandemic. And I managed to interview several of those airmen. And then, of course, we had the fire. And that required that we evacuate the base, that required that people evacuate their homes, that required that we evacuate aircraft from the base. And in terms of the stories, I need to hear the stories of the people who went to New York. I need to hear the stories of the mechanics who prepared those planes to depart. I need to hear the stories of people who left on-base housing, who were evacuated from on-base housing. Because if we don't capture those stories, they get lost.
The thing about the risk of what seems to be just another day, a day in the life for our brave airmen, they don't realize that it has such a big impact, especially in light of future events. As they say, right, it's not a matter of if it's going to happen again, it's just a matter of when it'll happen.
When it'll happen again, exactly. And yeah, one of my jobs as a historian is to act as the advisor to the commander on historical matters. And that means, in practical terms, that the next time we have a pandemic, the next time we have a fire, I need to be able to go to the commander and say, here is what we did in 2020. Here is what worked, here is what didn't. And again, that comes down to the personal stories, hearing people talk about what worked and what didn't, in terms of evacuating aircraft, in terms of evacuating housing, in terms of the deployment to New York. Those stories are vital, because they are going to inform future commanders.
Definitely. And I understand that whenever you capture all this historical data, it requires a tremendous amount of time, amount of attention to detail.
Yes.
Because, like you said, it's only as good as the sources that you have, and paying attention to those details ensures that we have very accurate information to operate with to address future events.
Yes.
I want to talk a little bit about the history of the wing itself, because we're always having new airmen coming through, through our doors. But even the old-timers, you can say the old-timers have been around for a little while, they may not necessarily know a whole lot about the wing's history. Is there anything interesting that you've come across in terms of our history?
Well, I think one thing is that we were formed as a troop carrier group in World War II. And then at the end of World War II, we were actually converted into a fighter-bomber wing.
Oh, wow.
We were a fighter-bomber wing for a few years before they returned us to troop carrier group status. One of the things that I find interesting is that in 1968 there was a crisis in Korea, a near war in Korea. in fact, as well as the Tet Offensive in Vietnam and heightened conflict in Vietnam. And the 349th was mobilized during 1968 to account for, to carry troops, to carry personnel and supplies to Korea and Vietnam. So we've been mobilized for several crises, the Cuban Missile Crisis as well. And we've been involved in virtually every airlift mission in the post-war period as reservists.
Now, to some, it may seem like eons ago when that has happened. With all those events unfolding, a lot of lessons learned. And definitely it's going to be applicable to future operations that we have. So I can imagine there's a wealth of information that you can share with our wing commander and the rest of the leadership when it comes to addressing maybe a similar type of situation in the future.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the lessons learned, for instance, in 1973, Israel went to war with its neighbors Syria and Egypt, and it ran out of ammunition. So it asked the United States to resupply it. And the United States agreed to resupply Israel, sending C-5s and C-141s to Israel. The problem is that the C-141 didn't have an in-air refueling capability at the time. So they had to land a small airport in the Azores, Lajes Airport in the Azores, which was not able to handle large numbers of C-5s and C-141s. It really slowed down the resupply effort. So one of the lessons learned there in the big scale is that the C-141, the C-5 needed to have the in-air refueling capability. And in the 1970s, then the late 1970s, that capability was added to the C-141s and were cruise trained for the C-5s.
You know, listening to you speak, sir, I can't help but be impressed with the wealth of knowledge that you have. It's amazing how you're able to recall all this information, but definitely that is crucial for your job and for your position.
Yes.
How do you plan on expanding our program, or your program, I should say, in order to really make the historical office a very crucial resource? What are your expansion plans, or what are your future plans for the office?
Well, two major programs I want to pursue. And one is reestablishing those links with the subordinate units, with the squadrons and with the groups, letting them know I'm out there, and also establishing or finding points of contact who will feed me information, who will tell me about the promotions, who will tell me about the awards, who will tell me about the exercises or the programs that the groups are running. So that's one of the major things I want to do. The other major thing is I want to use the web SharePoint site, the wing SharePoint site, I guess I should say, as my point of contact with the group, so that the group airmen can go to that web SharePoint site. And right now what they can find is the unit history, they can find a lending library, the books I have, and they can find an explanation of the unit crest, the unit emblem. That will grow in the future. The goal is to take the unit history and link it to, for instance, types of aircraft, to, for instance, operations that the unit has been involved in, so that the young airman who is at this SharePoint site and is reading the write-up comes across an operation called Nickel Grass, which was the resupply of Israel in 1973, and says to him or herself, I would like to know more about that. Can click on a link to go to Operation Nickel Grass and read all about that operation, the 349th's role in that operation.
I see. When you mentioned the lending library, I really like that concept, because I guess I can say I'm somewhat old school in the sense that nothing beats going through a book.
Yes.
Just reading. I mean, something gets lost when you're trying to read materials.
Yes.
At a digital
I agree
format.
with you wholly on that. Yes.
I can just imagine with your line of work here, you're going to come across inevitably some very interesting, I don't know if I'm using the term correctly, artifacts or maybe historical pieces that really hold some kind of historical value to our wing and maybe even to the base or even the Air Force. Is there anything that comes to mind that you've come across?
One is in my office when I finally managed to find a key and open up one cabinet, I discovered a sack full of wine glasses.
Okay.
They were apparently donated to us. They were apparently used in a party, a celebration given in 2012, and donated to us as a result of that celebration. Now, one of the problems with these is establishing what we call in the historical world provenance. Where did it come from? I don't have that. I don't know why these glasses were important. So it's a mystery to me, and I love mysteries. So I'm going to find out. I'm going to work to find out where these wine glasses came from. And I also have a flight suit, heavy weather flight suit, I believe it is, that I need to establish whose it was, why we have it in the historical office. So again, there are some mysteries that I'm facing, and I enjoy working through those mysteries to find out why we have this flight suit, why we have these wine glasses, because obviously historians before me felt they were important to keep.
Definitely. Yeah, it's kind of neat you talking about this. I was a big Hardy Boys fan growing up. I used to read the mystery novels. That's really cool to hear. And being a little bit of a sleuth, you have to do your research and find out how you can fit the pieces together. You've come across some interesting artifacts. Definitely some are a big mystery at the moment.
Yes.
And we can't wait to find out, if how you're able to connect those dots. On top of that, are there any established pieces or historical pieces that you have that came from an unlikely source or maybe came from a very interesting era or period in our history here at the Air Mobility Wing?
I think the thing that comes to mind is the former patches, past patches of the various squadrons. As they've changed patches, I've inherited the old patches. And it's always interesting to me seeing how these patches change over time, seeing how the presentation changes over time.
I definitely agree. When you talk about historical pieces, artifacts, one may think about Indiana Jones. So they might say, oh wow, maybe he's like doing some kind of digging around. I mean, not literally, but you're looking through stuff, finding items of historical value. Are there any myths that you've heard or interesting things that you've heard about what the historical office does?
Well, I think one of the myths is that we spend a lot of our time with documents. Documents are only one piece of the puzzle. There are all kinds of evidence out there. Again, a flight suit that I have no information on. Wine glasses I have no information on. There are all kinds of information out there. But the other thing is that historians only deal with the past. And that's something that I don't believe in as a historian. I deal with the present to a great extent. And again, talking about my mentor in grad school who went to Srebrenica to document massacre sites in the Yugoslav Civil War. That's very much about dealing with the present because he was presenting his evidence to the World Court in Hague for the prosecution of war crimes. So I think that if there is one myth I want to dispel, it's that I'm always about last week, I'm always about yesterday, I'm always about last year. No, I'm about us today, how we got to be where we are today.
That is so true. When we think about history, obviously you're looking at the past, but you're also looking at the future.
At the future.
Trying to tie the two together and find a resource that will help us and guide us as we forge ahead.
Yes.
Now, we're getting close to the end of our podcast. Are there any messages that you'd like to give to our 349th Air Mobility Wing members when it comes to those establishing the personal relationships?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to say I'm here. Email me, phone me, stop by my office. I'm always here for you. I'm here for the group. I'm here for the squadrons. I'm here for the individual airmen. And one of the things I want to say is that I'm trying to make the historian's office a full service organization. And by that I mean that I'm able to help the airman. If an airman is, in the course of his or her career, required to write a paper, for instance, as part of their promotion process, I have documents that we can use. I can find you documents if the documents you need don't match what I've got. I can help you with the writing. I've taught writing at the university level for 15 years. It's something I'm very good at. So consider me an asset. consider me a resource for the airmen of this wing. And that's where I think I have my greatest impact, is dealing with the airmen of this wing.
Excellent. So for the benefit of our podcast listeners, what is the best way to reach you? What email address would that be?
I'm at michael.blodgett.2@us.af.mil.
And is there a phone number that they can reach you at as well?
There is. Area code 707-424-5649.
Thank you very much for staying with us on this initial podcast for the 349th Air Mobility Wing. Again, this is your host, Master Sergeant Jose Aquilizan. I'd like to say thank you and have a wonderful day.